as a peace community, as a nation, and in the world. Since we last gathered, we've experienced losses, both great and small, due to the pandemic. We've witnessed the rise of the racial justice movement and the ever-increasing threat of a warming planet. Here at LEPOCO, we've persevered at the beginning of the pandemic to move 35 years worth of accumulated stuff to this lovely new space that we're sharing tonight. And thank you to all the volunteers who helped make that happen. And thank you to everyone who offered support through all these changes that we've experienced over the past few years. Before I turn the mic over to Mimi Lang and Monica McKagan, I just need to tell you one thing, that the bathrooms are through those double doors there at the front.
And to the right.
And so Monica and Mimi are going to do a reading, and then the Peace Chorus is going to welcome you with music.
Good evening, all.
Good evening.
My name is Mimi Lang, in case you don't know this. And this is a meditation about a sunflower that was actually written in 1997 by me. I do have a little speech difficulty, so please bear with me. A simple flower grown from seeds to feed the birds and ourselves, planted in place of missiles, O sacred flower. We imagine all your seeds bursting forth, green stems reaching for the sun. We imagine sunflowers in the place of all the nuclear weapons. Think of it. Sunflowers in space, sunflowers hidden away in Israel and North Korea, sunflowers stored by the thousands in secret sites in the US, France, and Russia. Imagine the surprise of the general who opens his silo to find sunflowers instead of the Titan missile. Of the Navy commander who finds a submarine full of sunflowers instead of nuclear warheads. Imagine if he had to direct the tending and growth of his batch of sunflowers. Imagine sunflowers pointed at strategic sites in Iran or India. O sacred sunflower, what great delight would we replace each nuclear weapon with your viney presence. We honor your energy in always reaching for the sun as we reach for the day when we can hold our faces to the light of a world brightened by sunflowers as we celebrate nuclear zero. This poem was inspired by the nuclear weapons that were taken out of Ukraine in 1996. Monica will explain that in a little further detail.
Mimi Lang is also the author of this letter to the editor of the Morning Call. It was published March 24th, 2022. Sunflowers offer a sign of hope. It was wonderful to read the article about sunflowers blooming throughout the Lehigh Valley in support of the people of Ukraine as they struggle to survive the Russian invasion. Sunflowers are bright and beautiful, offering all of us a sign of hope. In 1996, sunflowers took on the unique quality of being the universal symbol of nuclear disarmament. At that time, U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry and his Russian and Ukrainian counterparts planted sunflowers on the site of a former Soviet missile silo, symbolically saluting Ukraine's new status as a nuclear weapon-free state. Ukrainian President Leonid Kuchma called on other nations to follow in Ukraine's path and to do everything to wipe nuclear weapons from the face of the earth as soon as possible. We have not risen to the challenge. Let us renew our efforts to become a nuclear-free world, starting with the United States. That's Mimi's letter.
Gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. Gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside. Gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. Gonna teach peace around the world, down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. Gonna teach peace around the world, down by the riverside. Gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more.
Down by the riverside is described as an African-American spiritual. There are many variations and versions of it. It's a staple at Peace Camp. Next, If the People Live Their Lives is a Russian folk song. It first came to our attention through Paul Winter's Winter Solstice concert at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine sometime during the 80s. Those were momentous years for the peace movement. The mobilization for survival and the nuclear freeze were formed then, and while many feared the proliferation of nuclear weapons in the arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States, many of us also wanted to link with the people of Russia. We are again at a momentous time, and we ask, how can we embrace the people of Russia, many who are courageously protesting and resisting, and others who are fleeing? We again are called to differentiate the people from the regime. Listen to the folk song that causes us to celebrate the stars, the dancing, and the people. If the people live their lives.
If the people live their rose in the night.
Next, we'll hear from members of the steering committee. Charlie Domenici
I just want to hold on.
and Nancy Johnston.
Thank you.
LEPOCO Steering Committee plans and provides leadership for the monthly action meetings and thereby for the organization. Action meetings are held the second Monday of the month and are open to all members and friends. The election for the steering committee is occurring tonight. And we have Margot Hillman, Mary Lang, Monica McGagan, Tom Peterzak, Susie Ravis, and Julius Ivanch, co-treasurer. They're planning to continue to serve their 2-year steering committee terms that began in 2021. A special thank you goes to Diane Delinde, Nancy Johnson, and Dan Miller, who will not be seeking another term on the steering committee. Diane was especially helpful with LEPOCO's transition to a new office. Nancy Johnson has been instrumental in completing a draft for an updated LEPOCO brochure. Dan has provided leadership and assistance in many roles in LEPOCO. They will all three continue to be active in various capacities. Finally, because our at-large steering committee members can number as low as 6 and as high as 10, we will be too shy of a full complement with this election. If you would be interested in serving on the steering committee, or if you know someone that would be a promising new member for the committee, please talk to one of the steering committee members or contact the LEPOCO office. The people nominated to serve on LEPOCO steering committee for the 2022 to 2024 term are Charlie Domenici, me, Janet Nye, Tom Stinnett, and Jeff Vitelli.
I have the privilege to announce a brand new, updated, revised brochure. 4 of us met at least 7 times in 3-hour meetings and wordsmithed the old document, which probably was not revised since 10 years ago. So it's being distributed to you as we speak. I would tell you to look at this brochure, obviously, as a tool for recruiting new members, but I would also tell you, seasoned LEPOCO folks, refresh in your mind our beliefs, our mission, and our passion, as well as at least 10 ways you, as an individual, could make peace and carry on LEPOCO's work. The latest revision was over 10 years ago, and it didn't have words such as disinformation or drones. The new edition looked at history, looked at wordsmithing, and those kinds of things. And I'd like to read one quote from the new brochure to stimulate your financial support. LEPOCO is run by its members, whose dues, contributions, legacy gifts, and fundraising projects are the primary source of the organization's finances. So, enjoy your reading, and we hope to see you at future LEPOCO events. And these brochures are available, of course, if you need them. Thank you.
we have our beloved art raffle drawing, brought to you by Amanda Zanishenko and Margot Hillman.
So we're going to do the large batter bowl with matching syrup pitcher, whisk, and pancake mix donated by Monica Somerville, to whom we are very grateful. And the winner is Patricia Ewans, who I believe is here. You can pick it up at the end of the evening. We haven't figured out exactly how we're doing this yet, so there's going to be a little back and forth. Okay, the quilt by Romaine Laurie, donated by Ellen Buck, and we are, of course, grateful to both of them for their support. Holly Rivera, who I believe is not here. Next. So we will make sure she knows about it. The hand-turned wooden salad bowl by Lee Buck. Again, very grateful to Lee for once again donating a beautiful work of art. Joseph Mark, who I also believe is not here. I could do a dance, but
Please do.
Tulane generously donated a $25 gift certificate.
All right.
Joseph Mark again.
It's a lucky day. It's lucky day.
And this is the last one, right? Okay. A hand crochet by Michelle Sheehan, continuing the tradition that her mother did for many, many years.
Wow.
A hand crocheted afghan.
That is gorgeous.
Katrina Kraft. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica and Amanda. Okay, so next, I have a few announcements. Yes. Okay, so first, I just wanted to say if you didn't manage to get here early and check out the new office spaces downstairs, we're going to keep that open for a little bit at the end of the program. You're welcome to go down and check out LEPOCO's new space downstairs. Two, if you did not sign the card for Fran Dreisbach, please sign the card that's back in the entranceway. This is for Fran, who was a founding member of LEPOCO, and she's in her mid-90s, and really has been very faithful in attending events, but is right now recovering from a small stroke. So a little get well card would be much appreciated by her. Third, We invite you to make a donation to the Norwegian Refugee Council. There's a basket in the back, or where you came in, at the entrance, that will be delivered to them for their work with refugees in Ukraine. You can leave cash or a check, or their address is in the program if you want to send some money at another time. Fourth, lastly, before you walk out the door, please be sure to pick up your peace bag. This is a little goodie bag to thank you for sticking with LEPOCO. And it contains 2 locally baked cookies, a little bit of fair trade chocolate, and a new LEPOCO button that was designed by Amanda Zanashenko based on the t-shirt. So before we move on, I just wanted to take this time to thank all the many volunteers who have helped put this event together tonight. Thanks to the steering committee and the gathering planning committee, all of the volunteers who helped out tonight, and all the volunteers whose names you'll find in the program, because they've served on various committees throughout the years to help make LEPOCO the vibrant peace center that it is here in the Lehigh Valley. So I think we should give them a Okay, next we're going to hear a statement of the Ukrainian Pacifist movement against perpetuation of war, read by Margot Hillman and Tom Peterzak.
People are working for peace around the world, including in Ukraine. We're going to read the statement of the Ukrainian Pacifist movement against perpetuation of war, which was adopted April 17, 2022, so just a few days ago. The statement we have is a translation from Ukrainian and has some awkward phrasing to our English-speaking ears, so you may need to listen carefully.
The Ukrainian pacifist movement is gravely concerned about the active burning of bridges for a peaceful resolution of conflict between Russia and Ukraine on both sides. It is also concerned about signals of intent to continue the bloodshed indefinitely to achieve some sovereign ambitions.
We condemn the Russian decision to invade Ukraine on 24 February 2022, which led to a fatal escalation and thousands of deaths, reiterating our condemnation of the reciprocal violations of the ceasefire envisioned in Minsk agreements by Russian and Ukrainian combatants in Donbass prior to the escalation of Russian aggression.
We condemn the mutual labeling of parties to the conflict as Nazi-like enemies and war criminals, stuffed into legislation, reinforced by the official propaganda of extreme and irreconcilable hostility. We believe that the law should build peace, not incite war, and history should give us examples of how people can return to peaceful life, not excuses for continuing the war. We insist that accountability for crimes must be established by an independent and competent judicial body and due process of law, in result of unbiased and impartial investigation, especially in the most serious crimes, such as genocide. We emphasize that the tragic consequences of military brutality must not be used to incite hatred and justify new atrocities. On the contrary, such tragedies should cool the fighting spirit and encourage a persistent search for the most bloodless ways to end the war.
We condemn military actions on both sides, the hostilities which harm civilians. We insist that all shooting should be stopped. All sides should honor the memory of killed people and, after due grief, calmly and honestly commit to peace talks.
We condemn statements on the Russian side about the intention to achieve certain goals by military means if they cannot be achieved through negotiations.
We condemn statements on the Ukrainian side that continuation of peace talks depends on winning the best negotiating positions at the battlefield.
We condemn the unwillingness of both sides to cease fire during the peace talks.
We condemn the practice of forcing civilians to conduct military service, to perform military tasks, and to support the army against the will of peaceful people in Russia and Ukraine. We insist that such practices, especially during hostilities, grossly violate the principle of distinction between militaries and civilians in international humanitarian law. Any forms of contempt for the human right to conscientious objection to military service are unacceptable.
We condemn all military support provided by Russia and NATO countries for militant radicals in Ukraine, provoking further escalation of the military conflict.
We call on all peace-loving people in Ukraine and around the world to remain peace-loving people in all circumstances and to help others to be peace-loving people, to collect and disseminate knowledge about peaceful and nonviolent way of life, to tell the truth that unites peace-loving people, to resist evil and injustice without violence, and debunk myths about necessary, beneficial, inevitable, and just war. We don't call for any particular action now to ensure that peace plans will not be targeted by hatred and attacks of militarists. But we are confident that pacifists of the world have a good imagination and experience of practical realization of their best dreams. Our actions should be guided by hope for a peaceful and happy future and not by fears. Let our peace work bring closer the future from dreams.
War is a crime against humanity. Therefore, we are determined not to support any kind of war and to strive for the removal of all causes of war.
Next, we'll hear from the peace singers.
I saw a mighty room filled with women and men, and the paper they were signing said they'd never fight again. And when the paper was all signed and 1,000,000 copies made, they all joined hands and bowed their heads, and grateful prayers were prayed. And the people in the streets below were dancing round and round, while swords and guns and uniforms were scattered on the ground. In towns and cities round the world, the people all agreed to use all of their resources for meeting human needs. And homes and schools and nature parks were springing from the ground, with art and music everywhere, green gardens all around. Last night I had the strangest dream I never dreamed before. I dreamed a world that all agreed to put an end to war.
We just sang Last Night I Had the Strangest Dream, written in 1950 by Ed McCurdy. Our own Jeff Vitelli added the second verse. Our question is, why is it still a dream 72 years later? Plan to work together to put an end to war. The next poem, Higher Ground, was composed by Charlie King in 2007 about yearning to escape the quagmire of daily news and people harming other people. A higher ground is a safer area ruled by morals rather than violence and greed. We ask that our hearts be opened and for guidance to the higher ground. Our soloist is Ebony Alicia.
Soil that I have found, I'll plant my feet you can hear that joyful sound, a song of peace from higher ground. Oh, lift me up, let me stand upon some decent, honest land, sweeter soil than I have found. Oh, plant my feet on higher ground. Oh, lift me up, let me stand upon some decent, honest land, sweeter soil than I have found. Oh, plant my feet on higher ground.
I'm here to introduce our speaker. And I have prepared remarks, but I heard a secret just before we started this evening. It's from a close family member of our speaker. The close family member happens to be here tonight. And he shared with me the story that Stephen Miles, our speaker, was a member of the Boy Scout troop in his church, and in fact was about to be awarded the Eagle Scout, the high honor. And he was required to give a speech. Minutes before the ceremony where he was to speak, he confessed to that close family member, his father, that he had not prepared to speak. Now, the really wonderful part of this, his father was embarrassed Stephen, but the lesson I hear is that from a very early age, Stephen, take the mask off, okay? Ooh. That feels good. Okay. I hope you understood enough of the story so far.
Yes.
Okay. That night, with no preparation, Stephen gave a great speech. And it just was a precursor to what we know of his talents. We've heard it before. He's been with us. He was with us in 2015, and we know that he started at an early age in his public speaking career. We are so pleased to welcome Stephen Miles back to the Lehigh Valley. As president of Win Without War, Stephen is a strategist, public speaker, and strong advocate for a peace achieved through diplomacy, not war. Win Without War was created in the run-up to the Iraq War with a mission to pursue a different policy that rests on the belief that war is not inevitable. Stephen joined the organization 11 years ago, where he has provided significant leadership and policy development. Stephen was raised in Bethlehem. He's a graduate of Liberty High School. His mother, Julia, was a teachers' union leader, and his father, Don, is an attorney who provided the defense in the First Amendment case known as the Muhlenberg Five in the mid-70s, a case that was won before the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Stephen began his support of LEPOCO in his growing up years. He attended Peace Camp and other activities, among them the Christmas City Fair, where LEPOCO had a lemonade stand.
joined the assembly line of volunteers who took fresh lemons and turned them into refreshing lemonade. Stephen found the beverage in the red cups delicious, with lots of sugar. Stephen is a graduate of the London School of Economics and Tulane University with academic expertise in humanitarian interventions and Middle Eastern politics. Prior to joining Win Without War, he worked for the global campaigning organization, AVAZ, as well as on multiple federal, state, and local electoral campaigns, and as the executive director of the American Hellenic Council. Stephen is respected for his strategic thinking on war, politics, and policy. Representative Barbara Lee, member of Congress from California, who played a major role in the anti-war movement in her criticism of the Iraq War, and after September 11th, for being the only member of Congress to vote against the authorization of use of force, offered high praise for Stephen. She said that he provides the guidance, the strategic thinking in the tradition of outstanding analysts that policymakers need today. Win Without War expresses its gratitude for those people and organizations that, like LEPOCO, that understand that war is not inevitable. They close each email with the words, "Thank you for working for peace." As we welcome Stephen tonight, let our enthusiastic applause say, "Thank you, Stephen, for working for peace."
Take your mask off.
I'm going to, don't worry. I suddenly though don't know whether to feel if it's a good or a bad thing that I have a prepared speech tonight. So hopefully I can do just as well when I do prepare. Thank you very much, Janet, for those kind words. It was very nice to hear. It's an honor to be here tonight. It's an honor to be with you. It's an honor to be in my hometown. It's an honor to be here before so many friends, old friends and new friends. I'm going to reveal myself really quickly as a child of the 80s by starting my speech with a quote from Ferris Bueller's Day Off, so bear with me for a second. As a wise man once said, life moves pretty fast sometimes, and if you don't stop to look around once in a while, you can miss it. And so with that in mind, I'd like to thank Nancy, Janet, and everyone here at LEPOCO for giving me the chance to stop and look around, particularly in a place and with so many friends who've been present in my life for so very long. As it's already been noted, I am from Bethlehem. I went to school down the road at Nichman. I have been all over this town and have deep roots. And yes, I remember fondly, and more importantly, I remember fondly making and more importantly drinking that delicious lemonade at the Christmas City Fair. I also remember coming to Peace Camp and important traditions like marking the solemn anniversary of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings with lanterns floating down the Monocacy. Tonight we're also gathered, as been noted, in a place that I spent quite a bit of time. I came earlier today to check in and talk to the volunteers as they were setting up, and I had a very strange feeling of deja vu as I walked into and through a door, the back door, that I've walked through hundreds of times, but haven't walked through in 22 years. So it's nice to be back in this church and in this hall where I spent so much time in the Boy Scouts with Troop 318. And as was mentioned, in fact, 22 years ago, I was awarded my Eagle Scout in this very room, although the speech was within the hall, the reception hall down the hall. And of course, it was only 7 years ago, in 2015, that I spoke with you at the LEPOCO annual dinner. And I was honored and humbled that evening to be introduced to you by my mother, Julia, who unfortunately lost her long battle with cancer about a little over a year after that speech. I'll repeat now what I said then, which is that my mother helped instill in me from a very early age a commitment to peace, commitment to activism, and a commitment to pursuing a life driven by purpose and not by profit. And of course, my mother had help in teaching me those lessons from my father, Donald Miles, who many of you know and who I'm honored is with us here tonight as well. So of course, we're here not just to talk about me and my connections to Bethlehem, so I'm going to try to move things along here a little bit, because we're here to talk about the state of the peace movement in the United States and what the future holds. When Nancy and I first talked about this speech and talked about what I might discuss tonight, the world looked a little bit different than it does right now. Most notably, the Russian troops massing on the border with Ukraine, it was unclear if that was simply a threat or the harbinger of a horrific war yet to come, and unfortunately today we know that it was the latter. I also want to pause here and take a moment to note the powerful and beautiful message adopted after those events in March by LEPOCO, and also share my gratitude for the many messages of solidarity and peace that have been shared tonight. I think often of the old curse, may you live in interesting times. And my God, are these times interesting. From a pandemic that's taken the lives of more than 1 million people here in the United States and millions more around the world, to the rise of fascism once again here in the United States and around the world, to the growing reality of a climate in crisis and the destruction of our planet, the times are indeed interesting. With so much change and even chaos, it can feel difficult to take a step back and take stock of where we are, how we got here, and where we're going. And that's why events like this gathering tonight are so important. They give us the chance to do just that in community with one another, to come together, to reflect, and to share a moment of time together. In truth, there's a number of different conversations we could have this evening. We could talk about any number of conflicts happening around the world. Of course, as we've discussed already, there's the horrors that we're seeing in Ukraine, but we could also discuss the tragic violence going on in Tigray. We could talk about the 7 years of US-backed war in Yemen, including the recent ceasefire and the chances that Saudi Arabia and the UAE will once again resume dropping American-made bombs, dropped by American-made planes, on people in Yemen on the brink of famine. We could talk about the reality that today, more than 19 years after shock and awe, American troops are still in Iraq. Or we could talk about that a crisis is unfolding in Afghanistan, where not too long ago, American troops departed after 2 decades of failed occupation. Perhaps we could have a conversation instead about the global rise of authoritarianism and erosion of democracy. We could discuss things like a rise in China, a Hindu nationalist India, or the return of fascism across Europe. We could talk about the coup in Burma destroying their fledgling democracy, or the many coups across Africa that are led by US-trained military leaders. Closer to home, we could talk about the violence continuing to plague our own communities, both the recent rise in violent crime and the continued prevalence of police violence against so many of our Black and brown neighbors. Or we could talk about the moral bankruptcy of a country that chooses to invest $750 billion in rising every year in quote-unquote defense, while suddenly crying poverty when it comes to helping the world stop a pandemic that has already killed more people in this country than all of our modern wars combined. There is no shortage of conversations we could have tonight, but you all made the mistake of inviting a guy to speak to you who drove up this morning from Washington, D.C., and so instead I'm going to talk about the only thing we ever talk about in Washington, D.C., politics. See, in Washington, D.C., we have a bad habit of reducing complex events and complicated political dynamics to a very simple lens of discussing, debating, and analyzing the current occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And while I won't fully do that, I do want to start tonight with talking about the person who impacts U.S. foreign policy more than anyone else on the planet, and thus world events more than anyone else on the planet, the President of the United States. Joe Biden is the third president to govern during my time at Win Without War. I started during the hopeful days of Barack Obama and his administration, when we all learned that the change that we can believe in was sadly not quite enough of the change we actually needed. In 2016, I became the executive director of Win Without War shortly before the election of Donald Trump, an administration that can only be defined by a series of chaotic crises and challenges whose effects will be with us and felt for decades to come. And of course, all that brings us to Pennsylvania's own Joe Biden and his presidency. And in thinking about my remarks tonight, I was thinking about the fact that so often I'm asked a question in my job of how do I think Joe Biden's doing? And in truth, I often give the same answer, which is that I think Joe Biden is doing exactly how I thought Joe Biden would do. And I say that for a couple of different reasons. First, it is unlikely that somebody who has spent a half century at the center of American politics is going to be different than the person we've seen in that half century. It's unlikely that somebody who's been at the establishment, at the core of American politics, is going to represent radical change. And it's unlikely that when we come to the issues we're talking about tonight, foreign policy and national security, Joe Biden just doesn't have a track record. He has been at the very center of the Washington, D.C. foreign policy establishment and is unlikely to be an agent of radical change. In fact, his most senior advisors today, folks like Secretary of State Tony Blinken, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, are individuals who have served him throughout his career as an advisor and thus share closely his policies and his politics. And so all of that put together, for better or for worse, and I'm not here to debate how Joe Biden is doing as president. That's not my intention. But all that, for better or worse, brings us to the reality that Joe Biden is who we thought Joe Biden would be as president. Now, from my perspective, there are certainly areas where the president is doing the right thing, and there are areas where I wish he would do change. He would do something differently. But overall, his administration has not been surprising. For instance, it should not be surprising to anyone that Joe Biden pursued a policy as president of a complete drawdown of U.S. forces from Afghanistan that he championed a decade earlier as vice president. Similarly, as events are unfolding in Ukraine today, it should not surprise us that a man who came of age during the Cold War and understands the reality of nuclear-armed competitors is showing more restraint than some in Washington would indicate when confronting a nuclear-armed superpower. And while if you watch Fox News, you might think that Joe Biden is running some sort of radical socialist agenda, in truth, his administration is pursuing exactly the kinds of centrist, moderate politics on a number of issues we would have expected. Yes, the president is pursuing some significant increases in spending on a host of domestic programs and healthcare and infrastructure and other issues. But at the same time, he's not only continued the spending spree that Donald Trump started at the Pentagon, but his latest budget would take it even further and increase it to records not seen since the height of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, which are themselves more than $100 billion a year more than we spent on average during the Cold War. But perhaps no policy issue right now crystallizes the approach of the Biden administration more than the ongoing efforts to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal. The Iran nuclear deal was one of President Obama's signature foreign policy accomplishments, and it was in truth something that was incredibly successful. Now, I should confess at this moment that I spent a lot of time working on this issue, and I'm very close to it, so I am not what you would call an unbiased observer about this particular issue. But the reality is that it was a policy pursued by President Obama that quite simply put into practice a belief he routinely articulated, which is that adversaries could solve their differences on the international stage through diplomacy, not through war. It was the embodiment of the alternative to the policies that led to the Iraq War. It was the notion that countries could solve their security challenges at the negotiating table instead of on the battlefield. When President Obama embarked on this effort, it was by no means clear that it would be successful. It required tremendously hard diplomacy. It required a significant effort against some of Washington's most powerful special interests, and it required the president expending a tremendous amount of political capital. Importantly, President Obama succeeded. Unfortunately, only a few short years later, Donald Trump, then in the White House, and against the recommendations of his national security advisors, decided to pull the U.S. out of the agreement, pursuing instead a policy he called maximum pressure. Now, President Trump's maximum pressure campaign has been a maximum failure. And that's precisely why, as a candidate, Joe Biden declared that he would reverse that policy and rejoin the Iran nuclear deal. Now, as president, Joe Biden has unfortunately, or has in fact pursued those negotiations diplomatically, but he's done so with less urgency and with less willingness to take the political risks that President Obama did. Now, the days ahead will tell us whether or not President Biden will be successful, and we hope he will be.
But what the entire episode shows us once again is that Joe Biden is simply hoping to improve U.S. foreign policy, but not pursuing the kinds of radical changes that so many of us think are necessary to truly change the broken status quo of our foreign policy. Now, I feel like I should be fair to Joe Biden at this point and note that Joe Biden never ran on a campaign of hope and change. Joe Biden did not run promising radical changes. In fact, Joe Biden ran a campaign promising a return of stability, a return of away from the chaos of the Trump administration. And so I don't think it's surprising that Joe Biden is pursuing the policies he is. And so in that context, it may be surprising that I so often get asked how I feel about how Joe Biden's doing. But I think the reason I get asked that is because in the first year of his presidency, President Biden pursued a number of policies on his domestic agenda that were far more ambitious than his record would have indicated. They haven't all been enacted, but at least there was a discussion about them. There was a pursuit of them. And so for so many observers, the question I'm actually being asked is, if Joe Biden is being ambitious on domestic policy, do you think he's being ambitious on foreign policy? Or at the very least, do you think he's being ambitious on proposing these ideas? And again, my answer is no, I'm not surprised. But it's not because of who Joe Biden is, it's because of who we are in the state of our movement for a more peaceful foreign policy. If we want to understand why Washington is the way it is, we don't need to look in the White House, we need to look in the mirror. Now, before I go any further, I want to take a moment here to note that the folks in this room are amongst some of the most dedicated, tireless advocates and activists for peace that I know. So any criticisms I have about the state of the peace movement are not directed at us in particular, or in no way meant to diminish the tireless work that so many of us do for peace. In fact, I think when you look at the recent history of the U.S. peace movement, one of the more remarkable things is that it's actually a history with a number of tremendous successes, routinely up against some of Washington's most powerful special interests, who have far more resources to bring into the policy battles and the political fights than we do. And yet we win. All across the country, there are organizations and activists like LEPOCO who are dedicated to these issues, who are dedicated to the notion that the United States can do better on the international stage, who are dedicated to the notion that the United States' role in the world should be one of building peace and not so recklessly waging war. So at the same time, while we know that that's the aspiration, I think we all know that we're farther away from where we want to be than we should be. And at times, it seems like we're only getting further away rather than closer. So the question is why? There are, of course, many, many reasons, and some of them I want to acknowledge are far beyond anything that those of us here tonight can do anything about. The reality that U.S. foreign policy does not democratically reflect the will of the American people cannot be isolated from the erosion of democracy in our country. Similarly, we can talk about the corrosive influence of money in politics and the power that arms makers have in Washington, D.C. because of the money they wield in our political system. But that has to include a larger conversation of the role of corporations and the influence they buy in our politics. These are not isolated to the peace and justice community. But at the same time, there are some challenges within our community that I think we have to grapple with. When we look at the disparity today between the movement in this country for peace and justice, and for example, the movements for racial justice, the movements to confront the climate crisis, movements to address radical income inequality, I think it's clear that we have a long way to go in building our movement. So I'm talking right now in a little bit in big picture, in some vague terms and some abstractions, so let me talk a little bit more in specifics for a few minutes. I'm honored to run what is in truth one of the largest national organizations dedicated to fighting for a more peaceful foreign policy for the United States. And I'm deeply proud of what we've built, the hundreds of thousands of activists who regularly take action on our issues, my 12 colleagues at Women Without War who work every day as full-time staff. But for context, our organization operates with an annual budget just under $2 million a year, which is on par with many of our other peer organizations in the peace and justice space. But if you look at other sectors, what you'll find, in other movements, what you'll find is dozens of organizations with budgets 10 to 100 times the size of ours. In fact, there are numerous organizations in the environmental movement that annually, every year, return a surplus of revenue over their expenses. You'd call that a profit in the normal world. We don't call that a profit in nonprofit world because the whole point is really profit. But they're returning more in revenue every year than their expenses that are larger than any organization's total budget in the peace and justice community. All told, philanthropic giving in the ecosystem of organizations that work on these issues is less than 1% of the total philanthropic giving on all issues. And so I say this not to say that the problem we have, that all of our problem is that we don't have enough money, though of course we don't. But I say this more to point out that when you start from an aspect of comparing the peace and justice movement to other movements and ecosystems, often we need to understand that we're not just comparing not apples to apples. We're actually comparing apple seeds to oranges. Now, of course, I started this section of the conversation by saying we should look in the mirror, not saying we should look at our tax returns. So let me say a little bit more about why I think we have to look in the mirror. Because I think we have to ask ourselves what we can do as activists and organizations to not only make ourselves more attractive and worthy of philanthropic investment and support, but to actually make ourselves more powerful. I think we have to be honest and say that for too long, many of us have simply been focused not on building power, but on simply believing that the power of our argument would be enough. We have to be honest that while we've been understandably debating what we think the right thing to do is, more often than not, the decisions were being made in Washington not based on what was right or wrong, but based within the political confines that define the policy options in Washington. And I have to be honest that they seldom have anything to do with what's right or wrong. I don't think it's controversial to say that in the halls of Congress and in the corridors of power throughout Washington, D.C., it is not enough to be right, you also have to be powerful. Of course, building power isn't simply as a question of deciding we should build more power, that we should have more power. It's also a question of being strategic and recognizing where does our power come from. Throughout the peace movement, one of the coldest realities we have to grapple with is that too often our efforts to change U.S. foreign policy leave out the very people who are most impacted by U.S. foreign policy. Too often, those who are living with experience of what it is like to be on the receiving end of U.S. wars are left out of the decisions of whether or not the United States should start new wars. In short, we need to make a far more diverse and representative peace movement, and we need to do it quickly. The good news, and I promise I'm getting to the good news portion, the good news is that so much of this is already happening. When I think of the political leaders that I get to work with in Washington, D.C., I think of emerging leaders like Ilhan Omar, herself a Somali refugee, who can help lead a movement that champions those impacted by wars rather than simply celebrating those who are fighting them. I think of leaders like Pramila Jayapal, who after 9/11 helped lead an organization protecting immigrants and other Muslims impacted by the war on terror, and today is leading the Congressional Progressive Caucus. And yes, I think of longtime champions for peace like my dear friend Barbara Lee, who famously cast that lone vote against war after the attacks of September 11th, and today finds herself very much not alone on these issues in Congress. And so I'm inspired, I'm excited to work with those leaders, but of course we need more than leaders, we need people. And importantly, we need people power. Our movements can and must grow. We must reach out to new communities and partner with those who know the realities of war and who are committed to stopping them. We also need to build a movement that looks more like the United States. I want to share with you a story I have from a colleague who used to work in the labor movement, doing anti-war work within the labor movement. This colleague was a young African-American man, and he told me a story about growing up and one of his young friends who would come out in the early days to the protests against the Iraq War. And he came out and he was fired up, and he knew that people going to fight and die in the war were going to be people like him and those he knew. He was morally against the war with every fiber of his being, but he very quickly stopped going to the Iraq War protests. When my friend asked his friend why, he told him, "I'm not wanted there. There was no one who looked like him. there was no one in that march who was part of his community, and he felt left out and unwanted. That was a loss for the anti-war movement. That was a loss for our efforts, and we need to find ways to build a movement that lets everyone know that they are welcome, and that brings in individuals from all across the country so that we have a movement that looks like this country. We also need to build more partnerships with other movements who also recognize the interconnectivity of violence, racism, and bigotry. On this point, I know I'm quite literally preaching to the choir, as this is work that LEPOCO has done tirelessly through the years. But I think we have to be honest that too often, too many of our colleagues haven't. Too often we've heard people lament and groan about people not showing up or caring about our issues, imagining that solidarity is simply them showing up for us and not understanding that it is also us showing up for them. We need to simply retire that way of thinking. We need to recognize once and for all that truth we say all the time is that it's a truth, that without justice, there is no peace. And so again, the good news is so much of this has happened. The bad news is the challenges we face are growing by the day. In the coming years, nearly all of the challenges we are already facing will still be with us, but will be harder. And so the urgency with which we have to confront these challenges, the urgency with which we have to grow our movement, are only growing as well. Now, I'm aware that I've gone on far too long at this point, and I really want to save time for questions and answers, because in truth, as has already been stated, I'm much better when I'm not reading from a page, but in fact talking, and so I want to get to the questions. But I want to end with a story about why I'm so hopeful. A few years ago, I talked about Yemen earlier. A few years ago, many of us were working on an effort in Congress, and some of you may have been involved, to get Congress to pass a resolution ending U.S. military support for the Saudi Emirati-led war in Yemen. Now, this is something that had never been done. The War Powers Resolution, which was passed after the Vietnam War, had never been invoked by both chambers of Congress to actually instruct the president to end the war. And we were up against long odds. The Pentagon and all of its power was very much against us. Saudi Arabia quite literally had an army of lobbyists, some of the most high-powered, high-profile, powerful lobbyists in Washington, D.C. This was a lot to be up against. But at the end of the day, when it came time for the vote, we won. And a significant portion of that aid stopped. Shortly after that, I was talking with a colleague who worked on a different set of issues, and he said, I don't understand how you guys won. I don't understand how you could be up against all those forces, how you could be up against hundreds of lobbyists, how you could be up against the entirety of the Pentagon and its forces, and come out with a majority of Congress on your side. And I said it was very simple, that we had two things they didn't have. We had people and we had peace. The truth is, our opponents have to sell something that no one wants. No one wants famine. No one wants war. No one wants death. And so to convince people to buy that, to convince that our policymakers to follow those policies is a hard sell. And we can and do win when we show up. The trick is we have to show up and we have to do the work. But when we do, we win. So that's what I'm here to say. Let's do the work and let's win. Thank you.
Okay, we do have a few minutes for questions for Stephen. Is that you, Catherine?
That's me.
Speak.
I'm going to take my mask off.
Okay.
So I'm bringing this back to Ukraine,
Sure.
which I'm sure I speak for everyone here, has been a very dispiriting and painful thing to witness, and it's still going on. So recently I had a discussion with another LEPOCO member. It was almost a disagreement, and that person told me to read an article on common dreams, which I recalled I had actually read in the past, and it was written by Ted Snyder, who writes for antiwar.com and also for Responsible Statecraft. It was in the Common Dreams on April 12th. And he wrote that, and I'm quoting, "The US is inhibiting a diplomatic solution in Ukraine." He wrote that in 2014, Ukraine's President Viktor Yanukovych had a population in Ukraine that was evenly divided between those that wanted to join the EU and those that were allied with Russia economically or in other ways. And so, according to Snyder, Putin at that time offered that Ukraine didn't have to choose between Russia and the EU, and that they could deal economically with both the EU and Russia, and Putin offered this. And according to Snyder, Washington, our diplomats, our president, and the EU's leaders rejected Putin's offer. Do you agree that at present, which is Snyder's argument, the Biden administration is not actively promoting a diplomatic solution between Ukraine and Russia? Are they allowing the war to play out, hoping Russia is defeated, and that's a win for the Cold War sides in this? I personally hated that argument, but another LEPOCO member is convinced that it is the case and agrees with Ted Snyder. And I want to know what you think.
It's a great question, and I thought about, in coming to you tonight, I know Ukraine's on all of our minds, and I thought about talking more about Ukraine in my initial remarks, and I chose to speak more broadly first, in part because I suspected we'd get here in the Q&A, but also because I wanted to contextualize some of the thoughts that I have on Ukraine. I think we have to start with a couple of truths when it comes to what's happening in Ukraine. I think the first is what we've already discussed and heard tonight, which is that the violence and the horrors are real, they're ongoing, and all of our priorities should be first and foremost getting them to stop. There will be no accountability for the war crimes we're seeing. There will be no end to the suffering until the fighting stops, and that should be our government's first priority. I won't lie and say that everyone across the government, that is their first priority. It's a little more complicated than that argument lays out, I would say, but I do think what's very clear is that we need more of a concerted effort by our government to push for peace in Ukraine as soon as possible. But the second thing that I want to contextualize that is that too often our debates about Ukraine fall into a really problematic frame which erases Ukrainian agency, erases the reality that we are not actually capable of deciding everything that we want to have happen in the world and snapping our fingers and make it happen. And so if we think about the reality of this moment, the person who has to do negotiating, or the entity that has to do the negotiating, is the entity that's doing the fighting, which is President Zelensky and the Ukrainian government. And to their credit, they have been engaged diplomatically from day one. They've stayed at the negotiating table even after it appears that some of their negotiators may have been poisoned. They've stayed at the negotiating table even as it often appeared that there was no credible effort being put forward by the Russians. They've stayed at the negotiating table even as horrific war was being waged on them. And I'm belaboring this point a little bit because I think it is easy to reduce this all as something between the United States and Russia, or even more simply, as the media loves to do, somehow all about Joe Biden versus Vladimir Putin. And that's not what this is all about, and that's not the only dynamic of this. So the question of is there a diplomatic solution, at its core it will have to be a negotiated end between the parties that are doing the fighting, the Ukrainians and the Russians. Now it's more complicated than that, obviously. The Ukrainians are doing the fighting, but they're obviously being supplied tremendously militarily by the United States and by other allies. And it gets much more complex very quickly. the question about going back to 2014, sometimes in the conversation we go back to the NATO expansion after the fall of the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall. There is a reality in these kinds of conflicts that you can go further and further and further back, and it gets more and more and more complex. I think if you talk to an Iranian, their relationship to Moscow wouldn't just begin in the 90s. They would talk to you about the famine during the Soviet era. They would talk to you about the complexity of that relationship in all of its different ways. And when they talked to you about 2014, they wouldn't just talk about what happened in the Maidan and those events, but they would also talk about the invasion of the Donbass at the time and the 15,000 Ukrainians who died after. And that, as I understand it, significantly changed domestic opinion in Ukraine to the point where President Zelensky won in what was genuinely respected to be a free and fair election with an overwhelming mandate. Public opinion can and does change. Look at Finland today, which for a long time had a population very against NATO expansion, and right now is talking about joining NATO and is a wildly popular position. I say all that to not say that the US hasn't done things wrong or that there isn't more that we can do, but to really say it's more complex. And I want to end by saying something that I think is incredibly hard for us to do sometimes, which is to not put ourselves at the center of the story. You know, so much of what's wrong in US foreign policy is thinking that the solutions to problems all over the world are to be found in Washington, D.C. And we can't allow ourselves to fall into that same trap. Because even when we recognize those problems are coming from Washington, D.C., sometimes the solutions themselves will not be. And sometimes the best thing we can do is to do less. So I realize this is a somewhat long and not exactly a direct answer to the question. But I think when it's talking about Ukraine, it's important to center Ukrainians. And I think it's important to not say that I can stand here today and speak for what Ukrainians should do or shouldn't do to bring about war, what negotiations they should have, what they should be willing to give up at the negotiating table for peace. I'm not going to have to live with the consequences, and none of us will have to live with the consequences of those decisions. So that has to be up to Ukrainians. Of course, it's not that simple anytime you're talking about a conflict where one of the possibilities is an escalation into a nuclear war that kills everyone on the face of the earth. And so we do have a role in this conflict as people in the United States. We do have a role in demanding our president and our administration pursue peace and wisely not do things that risk direct confrontation. But we also have to recognize that we don't have all the answers and we can't have all the answers. I don't know if that fully answers the question.
Yeah, I mean, the article was really long, and I think his major point was that we're bankrolling the Ukrainians and that the administration isn't fully committed to a diplomatic solution because they want it to play out with our weapons so that Russia is weakened and the victims will be the Ukrainians. Despite their autonomy, they're dependent on our weapons and the EU's weapons. And that just seemed, I'm hoping that the administration is doing everything it can to negotiate something that's acceptable to both sides, if that's possible.
I say this not because I think they don't want to, but I say this, the last thing, and maybe we can take another question, is I'm quite sure they're not doing everything they can diplomatically. Not because, again, whether or not they want to or not, I can't even stress the magnitude with which we underinvest in our diplomatic efforts. I can't explain the disparity between the Pentagon, an agency that employs 2 million people, and the State Department. You know, the State Department's entire budget for diplomacy is a rounding error in the Pentagon's budget. So if we look at something and we say, geez, why is our solution to this the military? You know, we can think that it's because of a choice, but we can also use the age-old adage that a hammer is the only tool in our toolkit. And I think unless and until we change what we invest in, unless until we build tools of statecraft that exist outside of the military, when presidents find themselves in crises, they will always reach for the US military because it is bigger, stronger, quicker, faster, and more powerful than any other tool they have available to them.
Thank you. Rick?
I just had a comment on a little bit. There's an old ode, and I can't really remember if it was a poem, but it was a conversation or an agreement or a deal worked out between a cat and a mouse. And the outcome was the mouse got eaten. And when you talk about, you know, finding a peaceful solution to a situation in a country where you have all the wealth, might, and power of Russia, and a not particularly rational actor on one side, and a country who basically, you know, in the purpose of peace, gave up their nuclear weapons after Russia pulled out, had no defense for them. So it's really nice to sit down there and say we should be investing in peace and working on negotiations. At the same time, we can't stand by and let somebody else completely cat eat the mouse. You know, and I believe that peace should be a solution, but at the same time, in a practical world, it needs to come from something. Yeah. If you decide we're going to negotiate and not fight, then the war would all be over, and Russia would be completely taken over Ukraine and use it as a launching pad for Poland and everything else like that. So it's not just an either or.
Yeah.
You know, and like the article that you mentioned is somewhat naive in thinking that back when Putin said that in 2014, he actually meant it. You know.
I have no disagreements whatsoever.
Okay.
I think one thing I'll say, and then I don't know, maybe one more at the time for the question. I think a lot of our attention, for the same reason I was just talking about, that so much of our resources and our national treasure goes in to military solutions, so much of our national discourse is about that. And this is a hard moral question, and there's a lot of places it's debated about how should we help Ukrainians defend themselves, what are the right weapons, what are the right tools. I think organizationally for us, and for me personally, where we focus our efforts, not because we don't think those conversations should happen. We know they should and they are. But we don't have enough conversations in Washington about the reality of 5 million refugees having left the country and another 5 million domestically displaced within Ukraine. We don't have enough conversation. I think everyone here probably knows this, but Russia and Ukraine, between the two of them, account for somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of the annual wheat exports. And there is a real risk right now of so many places in the world, places like Yemen that I talked about earlier, that are dependent on Russian and Ukrainian wheat that is no longer being exported, either because of the war or because of the economic sanctions, sending millions of people, tens of millions of people around the world, deeper into famine and deeper into food insecurity. There's so many knock-on effects of this crisis, of this climate. People want to talk about accountability. We want to talk about sanctions on the Russian economy. It's also an opportunity to talk about sanctioning Russian banks doesn't hurt Russian oligarchs as much as we think, because Russian oligarchs don't necessarily have their money in Russian banks. They have their money in secret trusts in South Dakota and real estate holdings in Miami and New York City. So if we're going to tackle accountability, we want to talk about it, let's also have a conversation about tackling corruption in the United States. If we want to talk about banning Russian oil, let's not just talk about banning the very relatively small amounts of Russian oil that come into the United States, but getting the United States out of a fossil fuel system that, even if we're not buying Putin's oil and gas, is still fueling his war machine because others are buying his oil and gas. So let's get behind efforts like we're seeing from folks like Cory Bush and Bernie Sanders to use this moment to rapidly transition ourselves off of fossil fuel, off of these fuels that are literally fueling war machines of autocrats. And by the way, that has the side effect of helping us all save ourselves from the existential threat of climate change. So there's a lot of other parts of this conversation. I totally agree, we have to have a more honest conversation. But I think sometimes when, and you weren't saying this, Rick, but I think sometimes we focus on other parts because we know those other conversations aren't had, even though the ones that need to be had still also have to be had.
As I recall, when President George W. Bush first met Putin, he made this assessment, paraphrase. He said, I looked him in the eye, and I believed he's honest and could be trusted. That is what George W. Bush said.
I believe he said he saw into his soul.
That's right, he said that. Right, right.
He saw into his soul, you know, Sarah Palin saw Russia from reports. There's a lot of seeing going on. Yeah, I think we could talk quite some time about President Putin.
Can we take one more? Right, go ahead.
I was at a peace fair, Quaker peace fair, a couple of years ago, and I was handing out literature about cutting the budget, 10% reduction. And I had a long conversation with a man who said, no, peace through strength. And I was going to ask how you answered that, but I think you said, well, you build up an equivalent State Department, Peace Department, so that you have another tool in the toolbox. And also, I'm kind of curious how patriotism plays out in the halls, and how we honor the military, how that influences the way people drive each other in Washington.
Yeah, it's a great question. Let me answer the first part, and I'll come back to the second part. I'll say on the first part, look, if Republicans want to go back to the budgets of Ronald Reagan at the Pentagon and peace through strength, I'll be right there with you. It's like $200 billion a year less than we're spending now, adjusted for inflation. It is astronomical, the levels of spending that we're spending right now at the Pentagon. And it's not about strength, it's about corporate profit. More than half the money at the Pentagon every year is going into the hands of contractors. This is not about giving the troops pay raises or making sure that they have what they need. This is about lining the pockets of companies like Raytheon, General Dynamics, United Technologies, Boeing. These companies are making billions of dollars a year in profit, and they only do one thing for the most part. Boeing at least sells airplanes to other people. But for the most part, these other companies do one thing. They sell weapons to the US government. That's it. And somehow, we're letting them take billions of dollars a year in profit, and that's after they account for all their expenses, things like lobbying the federal government to get more money, right? That's not part of their profit, that's an expense. So they're spending tens of millions of dollars a year. The arms industry itself has more than 1,000 registered lobbyists. You would not believe the amount of corruption that is inherent. It's so corrupt that we don't call it corruption, right? Because it's just the way that it works. The people who run the systems at the Pentagon that decide which weapons get bought, when they leave, they go to the companies that were selling the weapons, and then they come back into the Pentagon later through the revolving door. Thankfully, folks like Senator Warren have some legislation to change these kinds of things, but don't let anybody ever fool you into thinking that this is about strength. The largest weapons system in the world, in the history of the world, is being built right now, the F-35, our next generation of fighter jets. The F-35 is called the F-35 Lightning. It's its name, the Lightning. It can't fly if it's lightning out. It shoots itself. It doesn't work. It is plagued with problems. The entirety of the system began in the late 90s. It's not even yet at the stage of full production. It's still in development. And by the time it gets there, the oldest planes will be so old that they'll be retired. In the meantime, other weapon technology, look, I'm not going to be an advocate for the Predator drone. The US drone system is horrible, but the Predator drone came into existence a decade or some year, maybe not decades, a number of years after the F-35 started. It's already been retired. It's lived its entire life as a program. These big programs, these big weapon systems, the new aircraft carriers, US aircraft carriers serve no purpose right now. Right? We all think they're cool and they're big and they're powerful. Aircraft carriers can't get close enough to China to fly the planes on them to attack China because the Chinese missiles that shoot the aircraft carriers shoot further away than our planes fly. Yet we're told we need more aircraft carriers to attack China. It just doesn't make any sense. It's all lies, and it's spread for the corporate profits of the arms makers. I could go on about that forever, so I'll stop. But the second part of the question, just remind me real quick, because I wanted
about patriotism and honoring the military.
Yeah, thank you. It is true that the U.S. military remains a tremendously popular institution, and that by and large is about the reverence people have for the individual men and women who wear the uniform. The U.S. military is at a time when every other institution of national stature is rapidly losing public support, whether it's the Supreme Court or Congress is, I think the old joke is, STDs have more popularity than Congress, right? So all of these things are deeply unpopular, but the U.S. military remains popular, and so what you have is you have politicians who try to buy their credibility by saying, I'm in favor of this popular thing, you must like me. So that's one part of it. But the other part of it is that people make their voices heard in support of the military, right? There was a piece of legislation we were working on, we were trying to stop, and it very minimally impacted National Guard forces around the country. Not every National Guard unit contacted every member of Congress, and the most liberal members of Congress you've ever seen, we went in and they said, we can't vote for this, the National Guard guys are yelling at us about it. The way to counteract that is to make sure that those of us who want a more peaceful foreign policy are yelling at them too. Because members of Congress will tell me to my face, I'm with you on ending this war, but nobody calls me about it. If I vote for more money for the military, I get a pat on the back from the arms makers, but if I vote against it, I don't get anybody patting me on the back. So we have to make it just as politically popular. We have to not just yell at them when they get it wrong, but congratulate our political leaders when they get it right and show them that there is support for this. As I said, it is tremendously popular. Somebody said to me, I don't see any big anti-war marches on the National Mall lately. And I said, yeah, but when's the last time you saw a pro-war march on the National Mall? There's not a major movement out there for war in this country. And there is majority support for peace and for diplomacy. But nobody knows that unless we make it heard, unless we make our voices heard with our political leaders. That's why I'll end where I ended before, which is we have to do that work. We have to make sure that there are more of us, that we're louder, and I promise you that they'll hear us. Thank you.
Thank you for ending on that positive note. And before we send you all out in the world to speak out about peace, we'd like to end with a prayer, a meditation, a wish for peace in the form of a song, Dona Nobis Pacem, which many of you know means grant us peace. The Peace Singers would like you to join us in singing this before you leave. And we'd love it if we could be a circle, if we could be in a circle as we sing it. So if you're able to move into the aisle, we could all see each other as we sing this final piece about peace.
Start on you. Okay. Elizabeth, do you want to stand?
I don't have anything to put on it.
No, I don't need it. That's fine. I've got this cane and I can lean on something if I have to. That's all right. All of you don't lean on me. She said she wants us to curve out.
So you can hear each other.
Dona